Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus is the international spokesman for the Israel Defense Forces. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with me here at the Media Line.
Thank you for having me, Felice.
On the day that Israel declared war on Hamas, those speaking on her behalf stressed that the path to victory would be a slow one, deliberate and costly. Now, some 68 days into the conflict, observers are amazed that rockets continue to fly into Israel and that the Hamas fighting force still remains pretty lethal. What unexpecteds did you have encountered in the last 2 months?
So we've been fighting for 68 days since the 7th of October. And as we said from the beginning, even before we started ground operations in Gaza, in order to dismantle Hamas, we said that we understand and know that it's going to be a long and difficult fight, that unfortunately we will have to pay a price in blood in order to achieve our goals, and that it will not be easy, but that our resolve is very clear. And all of us, soldiers in the IDF, our officers, commanders, the high command, all understand that we have to dismantle Hamas in order for Israeli civilians to be able to go home. Now, we have seen Hamas continue to operate throughout the war. We see that they still retain certain rocket firing and combat capabilities. Unfortunately, yesterday we had a mass casualty event in Sajaiya where 10 Israeli soldiers were killed from the Golani Brigade and our elite aerial rescue unit, our tactical air force unit. So there are still pockets of resistance in northern Gaza, and the fight isn't over there. There are still rocket launchers, and there are still tunnels, and there are still terrorists there. Of course, greatly degraded, but still there. And in southern Gaza, specifically in Khan Yunis, fighting is ongoing, and it will take a lot of time and a lot of effort in order to dismantle Hamas. But we shouldn't confuse time and patience with lack of resolve. Resolve is very clear, and we are going to defeat Hamas. There is no other option.
Lieutenant Colonel Conricus, looking at the loss of lives of your soldiers, did the IDF underestimate the power of Hamas?
I think what we can say safely is that Hamas has prioritized their military capabilities over everything else. And we can see as our forces advance and as we clear areas, houses, neighborhoods, and parts of cities from Hamas terrorists, after we defeat them and dismantle the enemy activity there, what we expose is hundreds of miles of tunnels, hundreds, almost 1,000 tunnel shafts, some of them very high tech and high level and high finish of infrastructure. And we find house after house full of weapons, IEDs, explosives, rocket launchers, and anything that Hamas couldn't get their hands on. So what I think we can say is that it's clear where Hamas priorities have been. They definitely have not been in developing Gaza, caring for civilians, building civilian infrastructure, schools and hospitals and mosques and roads and clinics. No, it has been in furnishing themselves with tunnels and buying and smuggling weapons so that they can go on their continued jihad against Israel. That will now be brought to an end. Hamas will be dismantled, and as our forces on the ground advance, we uncover what Hamas is leaving behind. We're documenting everything, and we're also sharing it with the world so that everyone can see where international aid has gone, where it was supposed to have gone, above ground, and where it evidently ended up underground in the hands of Hamas.
This has been going on for years, the smuggling of weapons, but do you believe the international community actually believes that today? You might be saying it here and on many other international programs, yet public opinion doesn't necessarily say they agree with the reality on the ground.
I think that polling indicates not quite what you say, because I see very solid support among US population, lots of sympathy towards Israel, the Israeli government even, and definitely Israelis, and there's a distinction between those three. And I think, according to the polls that I've seen, an overwhelming US majority, and I've seen polls of Western countries as well, an overwhelming US majority supports Israel's legitimate quest to dismantle Hamas. Based on what they've seen, what Hamas did on October the 7th, the atrocities, the murder, rape, the brutal executions and burning of corpses, and all of those atrocities that Hamas did, which seem distant now. It's been more than 2 months, but it's still very fresh in Israeli collective memory. People saw that, and people understand what monsters Israel is dealing with, and therefore people all around the world support Israel in our quest to defend ourselves. And I understand that there are certain elites, and there are editors, and there are politicians, and people who it doesn't fit with their worldview and agenda that Israel should be allowed to defend itself and to care for itself, and for Israelis to live safely within our internationally recognized border without being under fear of persecution, rape, and murder. But that's fine. They'll continue to harbor their negative views, and we will continue to build our country, defend ourselves, and defeat our enemies, as we have been doing since 1948.
The United States was very strong in supporting the Israel Defense Forces actions in Gaza. There's a bit of a shift. You see President Biden putting on some very strong pushback at this point, and he's saying he has to pull back. He's telling everyone, wrap it up in some form. How is this going to impact what the IDF is going to do in the coming weeks? What's the pressure point here?
I don't see one. And on the ground in the IDF, that is not the perception that we have. What I see in news events and what I see the president saying is, I stand with Israel and I support Israel, and Israel needs to get rid of Hamas. Those are clear words that I understand. I see a lot of journalists trying to corner the president and get other statements out of him, but I see a president steadfast in his support for Israel, unflinching and unmoving, and I think that is tremendous. That is the leadership that is so extremely important in times of war. And I see various other very important American officials, including senior spokespeople like Kirby, taking a very clear moral position on what needs to be done. Defeat Hamas, bring the hostages home, and do it in such a way that minimizes collateral damage and damage to civilians, which is what we're doing. We do listen to what our allies and friends around the world are saying. We do take into account the criticism that is voiced, and we do try to adapt, where applicable, our tactics on the ground in order to accommodate that. And of course, we communicate what we're doing on the battlefield to the world so that the world can see how we are fighting, and also, very importantly, what type of enemy we're fighting, how our enemy uses cynically the civilians at their, so to say, disposal that they have in Gaza, because it's really how Hamas looks at civilian Palestinians. They think of them as something disposable that they can use in order to get public opinion swayed against Israel and for Hamas. And in some cases it works, and some people are calling for ceasefire, and some people are adopting Hamas talking points. I think that's very unfortunate, but at the end of the day, our resolve is very clear. We understand what needs to be done, and we also understand that, really, frankly, we don't have a choice. If we don't defeat Hamas, our people, Israelis, cannot go back to live safely in their homes. And that is a result that is unacceptable, and therefore we will continue to fight until Hamas is defeated and our hostages return.
There are still a lot of hostages left in Gaza. Are you closer to getting any of them out? There were those in the IDF that attempted to bring two back. They brought two hostage bodies back, and unfortunately others were killed. Gadi Eisenkot himself, his son, was killed in that action. So what is it going to take? Is it going to be a constant race to see how you're going to get the hostage out, and yet you might lose more men in doing so?
It is a tremendous challenge, a tactical challenge. It's a very difficult mission to deal with because of how cynically Hamas is using the hostages as bargaining chips and as human shields. We have said very clearly from the beginning and continuously that we are going to spare no efforts in getting all of our hostages back, even if it means to conduct tactical operations which will put soldiers at risk. It is our commitment and our duty to bring our hostages back. If it can be done through diplomatic means, great. If it cannot be done through diplomatic means, then we will do it in any other way that is possible. At the end of the day, our moral and professional obligation is to bring our people back.
What are the numbers currently? How many women are being held today in Gaza?
As far as I know, there are 135 Israelis still held in Gaza, out of which 17 are women and children.
Does that include the hostage body that just came back? Is it down to 136?
I know 135. That is the latest number I have based on the latest information.
So is it 16 in terms of women at this moment?
We're talking about 17 women and children. I could be mistaken by one. These are moving figures after all. But in any case, the very important thing is that Hamas, they themselves violated the agreement that they pushed so hard in order to achieve. In return for temporary ceasefire or pause in operations, they were supposed to return 10 live Israeli civilians, women or children, every day. They failed to do so. They violated the terms of the agreement, and then they also started firing. And there's a lot of speculations as to why they did that. I'm not going to speculate about it, but a lot has been said about it. But at the end of the day, contrary to Hamas claims, there are still at least 17 women and children still held in Hamas captivity 68 days after the war started.
The Wall Street Journal just came out with a story that you are flooding the tunnels. It's definitely something that has been discussed. Is there anything you can share about this, with the concerns that it can hurt the fresh water that the Gazans will need?
Hamas has been digging tunnels for many years, and we have been developing different countermeasures and techniques in order to deal with tunnels, both those tunnels that were dug into Israel, what we call terror tunnels, in order to infiltrate into Israel, and also their underground infrastructure that they have inside Gaza, which is really the backbone of their combat network. I can't go into details. I can say that we are looking at different capabilities and different components, and we want to turn the tunnels from an asset that Hamas has really to a liability and eventually to their graves. And that is our intention. We're taking everything into consideration, the location of Israelis that may be held captive in certain areas, and other considerations. One of them you mentioned, but at the end of the day, these tunnels will hopefully be the undoing of Hamas.
Looking ahead, and is it too early to look ahead for an end game, for where the Palestinian people will be left, how Israeli borders will be secure? There has to be strategy that's being discussed at the moment.
I'm sure there is, yes, and it's an important part. The IDF is part of discussions at the cabinet and government level. We voice our input when asked, when solicited, and at the end of the day, the IDF will implement the directives given by the government. I hope, as an Israeli, that a good and long-term solution can be found, one that first and foremost ensures the security and the sense of security for Israeli civilians that hopefully soon will be able to go back to their homes, rebuild their communities despite the heavy losses that they've sustained, despite the damage to their beautiful communities. They'll have the power, they'll find the power, and with the help of the state and other people who'll be helping, also the resources in order to rebuild those communities and hopefully make them grow beyond what they were before. But that is really reliant on, first and foremost, security being available and stable for those civilians to be able to feel safe in order to return there. And then I hope that the international community will see it fit to join in and help for once fundamentally change the situation in Gaza. When we will free Gaza of the terrorist organization that ruled with an iron fist, a heavy hand over Gaza for the last 17 years, then that will be an opportunity for positive, more advanced forces in the region or nations in the region to invest in what's happening and hopefully bring about a positive and sustainable future for Gaza. I care most about Israeli civilians and our security, but I also understand that if there's prosperity and stability and education for human values and perhaps even democracy on the other side of the border, that's probably a good thing for us as well. So I am hopeful that that will happen, and I'm hopeful that there will be international partners who will see it fit to rise to the challenge and do something good for a change when it comes to Gaza.
What are the biggest obstacles that the IDF is facing now as they're trying to wrap up this war, particularly in the north?
Yeah, I don't think that we're quite there yet. Mentally, we are definitely not thinking about wrapping up. We are knees deep in fighting, and there's still a lot of heavy lifting to be done. Hamas is still has combat capabilities in southern Gaza and still needs to be eliminated. We still need to take out the leadership, their command and control, and to dismantle and take away their military and administrative and financial capabilities. So that's still ahead of us. In the north, if you're referring to Hezbollah, then there is also a very significant challenge. And as I said before regarding Gaza, I think it's very clear that we cannot ask our civilians to return to their homes and to be at risk of reliving the atrocities of October the 7th that happened along the Gaza border, and that the security situation needs to change. The Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, said so very clearly when he spoke with local leaders, is that before we ask you to go back, before we tell you that it's safe to go back, we will make sure that it's safe and that the situation on the ground will not go back to what it was on October the 7th. Obviously, the first choice that Israel, or the first option that we will entertain, is not the kinetic military violence one. But if we are left with no other choices, if diplomacy fails and if other options will fail, then of course Israel will have to deal with the situation and will have to deal with the presence of this Iranian proxy at our doorsteps, hundreds of yards away from Israeli communities. That is unacceptable, and it will not be the reality after the war. Let's hope that people, nations, and institutions that have an interest in the safety of Israelis and the integrity of the state of Lebanon will intervene soon enough so as to avoid unnecessary bloodshed and destruction and the horrors that a war between Israel and Hezbollah may entail.
Videos are circulating showing Hamas taking over humanitarian aid that's designated for their own people. What can you add to that in terms of what you're going through and trying to get people to the right places, suggesting where it might be a safe zone, and also the obstacles there in terms of getting humanitarian aid to the population?
Yeah, so the true colors of Hamas are showing. It's evident that they have absolutely no regard for civilians, for Palestinian civilians. They continue to use them as their human shields and as expendable assets in their political game against Israel. We see them looting UNRWA warehouses. We see them taking over humanitarian trucks and convoys. We see them stealing fuel. We see them stealing food and medicine that is intended through the generous aid of the US and the help of Egypt and many other parts of the international community. They're intended for good humanitarian purposes, and many around the world hope that it will get to their civilian addressees. But at the end of the day, Hamas has one goal. Their goal is jihad, holy war against Israel. They want to annihilate Israel. They want to do the October 7 massacre again and again and again. And for that aim, they have no problem with taking humanitarian aid, with stealing fuel, or with taking food that is intended for Palestinian children in hospitals in Gaza and bringing it underground into their tunnels for their fighters to have instead of civilians. So it's abundantly clear. We've been saying that all along, that Hamas abuses the civilian population. Our hope is that more and more people around the world will see reality and acknowledge the fact that Hamas is violating everything that is supposed to be holy and all of the basic tenets of humanity. They're committing crimes against humanity on a daily basis. And I hope, really hope, that UN and other humanitarian organizations will finally come around and speak the truth about what's happening in Gaza and call Hamas out for what it is, a terrorist organization that brutally abuses the civilian population. And it is about high time that UNRWA and other organizations start calling Hamas for what it is and start helping us help save Palestinians from the horrors of warfare and get them out of the battle zone, provide them with the international humanitarian aid, and make sure that it doesn't go to the wrong hands of Hamas.
The clock is ticking, and the families of the hostages are deeply concerned that they may not see their loved ones. Big difficulty for the Israel Defense Forces, especially now that you're pushing forward with possibly flooding tunnels. What do? How do you secure those hostages at this moment?
As I said, it's a very, very sensitive topic, an extremely complex and very challenging tactical mission. Because of the sensitivity, I can't go into the exact details of the tactics of it. What I can say is that it is a top priority of the IDF to get all of the hostages back. We spare no efforts, intelligence, manpower, resources in locating the hostages and trying to bring them home. Unfortunately, one effort that we conducted a few days ago ended with only us being able to return the bodies of hostages, but we will continue to collect intelligence, devise plans, and where feasible, execute plans in order to get the people back. We are aware of the situation, and I think one thing that should be said is that for 68 days, these Israelis have been held in inhumane conditions, and the Red Cross has yet found the ability or the political will to actually go and implement their mandate and visit these hostages, many of them women, children, and civilians, but soldiers have rights as well under the Geneva Convention. All of them are entitled to a visit by the Red Cross to make sure that they are receive medical help, that they are safe, and that their basic needs are taken care of. That is what's supposed to happen. Sadly, that has not yet happened, and it wouldn't be a minute too soon once the Red Cross actually gets access and implements its mandate.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, international spokesman for the Israel Defense Forces, thank you for your time and wish you strength.
Thank you. Thank you, Felice.